I'd like to introduce Fiona and Ewan from AIATSIS, who are going to talk about the administration of Aurukun archives held in AIATSIS. Again, we'd like to thank AIATSIS for all their help with this conference and digitising some of the material that's being shown here. And I think I'll just hand over to everyone. This is a Restoring Dignity session, and this will be the first speakers, and then we'll have another session, all really to do around repatriation of archives, as well as human remains as well. So thank you very much. Take it away, Fiona.
Well, thank you for coming to hear about the administration of the Aurukun archives held at AIATSIS. I'm Fiona Blackburn. I work in the manuscript section with Ewan. And I'll begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which Melbourne sits. I also want to acknowledge the Aranda people of Alice Springs. I started working in libraries at Alice Springs Public Library, looking after an Indigenous knowledge collections, and I also, for the same reason, must acknowledge the Ngunnawal people of Canberra and the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who also live in Canberra. Without the willingness of those people to engage with my work, I wouldn't have been able to do my job. And I suppose more broadly, the dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, combined with the willingness of their descendants to then engage with the work of archives, means that I am where I am today, and most of us are, I think. Earlier this year, the manuscript team were working on Aurukun Mission papers 1891 to 1982, and then the Aurukun Mission School papers 1970-1972, at a time that the Aurukun School was closed after violent incidents directed at teaching staff. In the ensuing storm swirling variously around Noel Pearson, the Queensland Education Department, leaders of the Aurukun community and members of federal parliament, a picture emerged of a dysfunctional community engulfed by intractable problems. Ewan found one article, let's see if I can just work, yay, printed in the August 2016 Women's Weekly, which had a different narrative. This article was open about the problems the community has, but it nevertheless told a story about a rich tapestry of a community of determined groups working to keep children in school, planning for economic development, including developing employment opportunities, transforming the Indigenous Knowledge Centre, of people generally who are not going to shut up, no matter who tried to intimidate them. These sentiments resonated with the picture of Aurukun that emerges from the quite large holdings that AIATSIS has. It seemed that these holdings could buttress the community, provide something on which they could draw to withstand the negative press and build their aims. The AIATSIS holdings document difficult times, and their usefulness would perhaps be limited if they didn't. But in their collections, it's clear that there are strong, articulate leaders, and always have been, who have a clear sense of what they want and what is possible in their circumstances. Now, our abstract promised a case study of transformation in management and co-management of our holdings, but what actually follows is a deep review of our holdings and what the formation of those holdings might suggest about transformation. And now Ewan will outline exactly that review and what it reveals.
I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional landowners here, and also the Wik people, whose land we're talking about, and point out that some of the images that we show people who have passed, and I'll give you a warning over that. This argument's a little contorted, and rather than drag you through, rather than let the argument be discovered bit by bit, I'll just outline it so you know where we're going. That is that the Aurukun archives at AIATSIS have two parts. There's a research part of it and a community archives. The Aurukun archives are the product of a considered documentation strategy. They were developed, that strategy was developed in response to political events. The research archives were produced, gathered, controlled and deployed in collaboration between WIC leaders, researchers and the Institute, mainly in the period 1975 to 1990. The main purposes of the archives were in support of mapping cultural sites and for particular purposes of supporting the outstation movement and as evidence for the WIC native title claim in 1993. Subsequently, that is after the WIC title case was concluded, the relationship between the WIC people and the Institute faded and the Aurukun archives became dormant. And we're asking, is it time now to revive the relationship between the Institute and the WIC people and how that might be done? I want to start off with an account of the WIC country. You can see it there, marked quite clearly on the west coast of Cape York. It's the traditional country of the WIC, Gungu and Wickway people. It's situated along the west coast of Cape York, south of Weipa and the Embley River, and as far down as the Holroyd River. And most of the country is now covered by 4 native title determinations. The land of the WIC and Gungu people is south of the Archer, which divides the WIC country, and the land of the Wickway people is north of the Archer. The WIC Munkin is the lingua franca, but there are 15 languages spoken in the region. The land is rich in resources and culture. Cape Cavere, which is about 70 k's south of Aurukun, is the point at which Dutch voyagers turned around in 1606, Cavere turnaround. It's recognised in the Register of National Estate. If we didn't knock one up further, that's it, yeah. That's actually the Aurukun region. Cavere is pretty similar, a bit more sandy. In the registration for the National Estate, it says that it's the place where Aboriginal people first encountered Europeans, their firearms and their alcohol. The Aboriginal response was determination to resist aggression, which is still celebrated in oral traditions in the area. The register records 300 sites that were surveyed in the Cape Cavere area. This dense concentration of cultural sites at Cape Cavere is typical of the WIC country. In 1990, Peter Sutton reported there were 2,085 sites recorded in the coastal strip from the Embley down to the Edward River. Until recently, there's been little non-traditional use of WIC land, except for some cattle grazing and timber cutting, but now Rio Tinto is constructing a bauxite mine in parts of the Wickway country along the coast north of Aurukun, below the Embley River. It's due to start production in 2019. There's a change. Moravian, now I'll give you some background on mission history. Moravian missionaries established missions in Western Cape York with the assistance of South Sea pastors. First at Mapoon in 1891, then at Weipa in 1898 and finally at Aurukun in 1904. The Aurukun Mission was administered by the Presbyterian Church. Reverend William Mackenzie and his wife Geraldine supervised the mission for a long period from 1924 to 1965. John von Sturmer was an anthropologist, worked up in WIC country from about 1968. He pointed out Mackenzie maintained language and ceremony, that his confrontational behaviour accorded with WIC custom. Reverend Mackenzie was known as an authoritarian and a charismatic figure and a disciplinarian. It's said that his harsh punishment of offenders helped to protect WIC women and children from domestic violence. The WIC people respected the Mackenzies. Perhaps not all of them. In 1953, 7 Aurukun men were removed to Palm Island for causing an uprising over low wages and compulsory mission work. When David Martin first started working in the area in 1975, he said that he was struck at the time that the people, the WIC people were, he said, politically feisty, assertive, upfront and confident of their rightful place in the world. Now a bit about the archives. Here we go. The anthropologist Ursula, I should point out, those shots are 1977. They're taken That one by McGarvey, who was a or a settlement administrator. And it's got a big set of photographs. You'll see not a great deal of difference between there and earlier shots in the 60s, which we'll show later. Ursula McConnell and Donald Thompson worked up in Cape York in the 20s and 30s. One of their bases was Aurukun. In 1936, the Presbyterian Mission made a film. It's called A Walkabout. It's a beaut film. It's made on its Cape York missions at Mornington Island, Mapoon, Weipa, and also filmed a corroboree at Aurukun. But not much happened between then and the period 1958 to 60, when Ken Hale, the master linguist, recorded Wik languages. In 1961, there was a seminal conference, the one that started off the Institute of Aboriginal Studies. It's called the Australian Aboriginal Studies Conference. And the argument in that was for an establishment of a centre of Aboriginal studies. And its purpose was, and a quote, to build up collections of precious records and materials in danger of becoming lost forever, and which would constitute a permanent record of Aboriginal culture and a rich stock of material for all students of Aboriginal life. The initial function of the Institute was as a documentation centre. The Aurukun archives held at the Institute are the product of the Institute's documentation strategies. In November 62, the Institute's first principal, Fred McCarthy, arranged with Reverend Mackenzie to go up and film dances, Wik dances. The Aurukun was then described as a virtually closed community. The film, it's called Dances at Aurukun, was made by the Commonwealth Film Unit under the auspices of the Institute and with the cooperation of the Presbyterian Mission. The rushes are now held at the Institute. There's 44 reels of rushes. McCarthy's photographs of the occasion also held by the Institute. Totemic figures made for the dances were taken back to Canberra and displayed at an exhibition curated by Helen Verm at the Institute of Anatomy the following year. That was 63. Perhaps those figures are at the National Museum now, transferred from the Institute of Anatomy. But Wentworth went with them. Wentworth was the politician who was key person to establishing the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies. He went up there to microfilm Aurukun birth, deaths and marriage registers. Borrowed a microfilm camera, 16mm camera from the National Library to do it. Some of his film was a bit overexposed, but it's held at the Institute too. It's MF1. I'm sympathetic with that. I used to make a lot of microfilm. Until recently, the Institute's main activity was funding research work by its own staff and by grantees. Grants stimulated scholarship in Indigenous studies in other Australian institutions, and the research materials produced by staff and grantees formed the core of the Institute's archival collections. Cape York was identified as one of the 5 areas where the Institute found the most strongest possibilities for research on traditional culture. They developed a bibliography, a database, 160,000 entries by 1967. They were working fast. They put out a bibliography, Beryl Craig's Cape York bibliography, the second in a series of published bibliographies published in 1967 to aid the planning of research. In the meantime, 1956, large quantities of bauxites discovered on Cape York. The Aboriginal reserves at Mapoon and Weipa were leased to Comalco in 1958 and then to Alcan for bauxite mining in 1965. Old Mapoon was burnt down at night time in a raid by the police. The people were shifted out. The mission station at Weipa, located at the centre of the bauxite deposit on one of the best natural harbours in the north, became a company town. The people were shifted out. But Aurukun was protected up to 1975, when, during the interregnum after the fall of the Whitlam government, the Bjelke-Petersen government sneaked through the Aurukun Associates Agreement Act. It was targeted at mining Wick land. It granted another lease. It's called the Aurukun Bauxite Project. The lease was on Aurukun Aboriginal Reserve, immediately inland of the Camalco lease. Very hard to get diagrams of the leases, but I'll leave it at that. Donald Baikina, who was the chairman of the Aboriginal Land Council at Aurukun, obtained an injunction against the 1975 Aurukun Bauxite Project. That injunction was referred to the Privy Council in London. This story goes right to the top. There was a 2-year reprieve while the Privy Council worked out what it was going to do about the injunction on the development of the Aurukun Bauxite Project. Our survey of the Aurukun archives indicates that field workers are major contributors to the archive. The conduct of the field workers projects can be traced in the Institute's administrative records. The research committee minutes record the research strategies and directions, and also record the research grant recommendations. The project files held by Grace hold field workers' correspondence, reports, maps and samples. They are an integral part of the Institute's Aurukun archives. Now, in response to the Aurukun Associates Agreement 1975 and subsequent political events, until 1990, the Institute's field workers collaborated with Wik people to run research projects documenting Wik sites, clans, languages and cultures. It was a collaboration with the Wik councillors and other elders, and the Institute devised the documentation strategy organised as this series of research projects. The first of them, that's the sites mapping north of the Archer River, was the trigger was Fred Kerrendon's letter to the then principal of the Institute named Peter Urko. He wrote in December 75. This is after the Aurukun Associates Agreement had been struck. Not long after, it was November that it was struck. He said that he'd asked John von Sturmer to help me with my poison places, he said. My father told me to protect them. We do not want to lose them. We do not want to lose everything, like what happened at Weipa. In response to Kerrendon's agreement, the research committee recommended that the Institute fund the Aurukun Council to engage the assistance of John von Sturmer and Athol Chase to help Kerrendon map country north of the Archer River. Then it was taken up more widely in the Institute. In March 76, the Institute's research committee took a new turn. It formally resolved to reorientate its research priorities towards addressing contemporary matters. In May 76, the Institute held its biennial conference. I think it was here in Melbourne. Fred Kerrendon was brought down to speak to it. He said, I feel after my father died that it's my responsibility to protect my sacred sites. That's why I asked John and Athol if they could do the mapping for me. I think that everybody at Aurukun or around the territory is very keen on their sacred sites. The Gove was going at the same time. I have met a lot of people up Darwin from territory. We're all talking about the sacred sites a lot at the meeting we had in Darwin. It's really sacred to us. We like to protect our land. We don't want our land to be destroyed. That's why, he said. So the Institute heavies picked up on Aurukun's speech. An audio tape of the speech was sent to Ian Viner, he's Federal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. The Principal Urko pointed out that it showed how Aborigines ranked the importance of their own sites. After the conference, von Sturmer, who had been with Kerrendon down here in Melbourne, went back up to Aurukun and he wrote back to Urko. He's reporting on the excitement at Aurukun and the strength of the outstation movement. He writes, land, 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 make a big effort to get out here. The whole thing is caught on fire. I think the Institute should be mobilised to cope with it. And Joseph Schwartz, who was the Institute's Registrar of Aboriginal Sites, and that's another story, wrote to von Sturmer in September informing him that he was compiling a report of information relevant to the reserve land outstation stations. He had 300 pages so far when he wrote. Meantime, the Aurukun film project gets going. They made 3 films. Here are the Ronin Films set, which you can obtain from them, along with many other of the film, the Institute's film unit productions, about 25 in total. The Aurukun's film project started in September the following year, 77. The film unit crew, Judith and David McDougall, began by filming a film called Familiar Places. It's a film about Angus and Chrissy Nampunan visiting their hereditary clan land with their children and with Peter Sutton, who was doing the mapping of the land for them. And it says in the film, I like this, that the Napunans hoped to live there one day, and they said, I think it's Sutton saying for them, facing the world on their own ground, not turning their back on the world. I thought that was a nice statement of the outstation movement. In January 78, the Privy Council overturned the injunction on the Aurukun bauxite project. The Queensland Government duped the federal government and took over the Aurukun and Mornington Island peninsulas. The McDougall's film, Takeover, was made on site at the time. We've got a clip from Takeover, which, if there's time, we'll show at the end, due to technical difficulty. But I hope we do get a chance to show it, because it shows Gladys Tippengumpa, who later on danced outside the High Court once the Wick case decision was made. It shows her as 20 years earlier and still is just as feisty. If we don't get there, here's what she says. Anyone outside thinking of violence here, well, they're wrong. By just talking strong, that's the way we're doing it. We won't fight anybody. If my grandfather was still here, he would steer them other men. He would spear them other men. But now he's dead and gone. But the way she says it is just stunning. Following the takeover, a general meeting of the Institute members resolved to express its support for the outstation movement and self-management, and out of grave concern over land rights in Queensland, particularly in Aurukun and Mornington Island, urged the Commonwealth and Queensland governments to secure the land rights of those Aboriginal people in perpetuity. The Institute Council issued a press release to that effect, and over the next few years continued to work closely at an official level with the Federal Minister and the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in support of the Aurukun outstation movement and self-management, particularly on mapping shire boundaries and subleases, which was the project undertaken from in the late 70s into the early 80s south of the Archer River. The results are evidenced in the volume of research archives that were produced by the Institute in all formats. And here is a summary of the product. And I won't spend too much time on it because I can see we're chewing through the time. But audio 70 entries in the Mura catalogue, 23 researchers produced them, a couple of hundred members, WIC people, community members and performers, and on top of that, the mission audio histories, oral histories are very extensive, pictorial, enormous amount, maybe 4,500 photographs, manuscripts, 2 key collections of Sutton's and John von Sturmer's. John von Sturmer's very strong collection. Field notes and reports. And moving image 29 titles. So very extensive and supported by the other arm of it, the community research, the Aurukun Community Records. And they were instigated by community members, well actually initiated by the first part by John Adams, who was the Aurukun Community Advisor. He wrote to Urco suggesting that the records of the Aurukun Mission, now defunct, having been taken over, be transferred to the Institute. And they jumped at it. The Urco and his deputy, Warwick Dix, gave the proposal their full support. Dix wrote, "We must get this stuff." They pushed Brownlee Kirkpatrick, who was the Institute's senior bibliographer, to accomplish the transfer. The papers were shipped by a community member, Jane Kariuka, the following year. Diane von Sturmer, John von Sturmer's wife, arranged and described them. The guide was published by the Institute. Reverend John Brown, who was General Secretary of the United Church Mission, objected to the transfer. He said all our other mission papers are at the Mitchell Library. He wanted the records transferred from AIATSIS to the Mitchell, but it didn't happen, and eventually Reverend Brown acquiesced and supported further transfers from the members of the mission into AIATSIS. The mission record stimulated the project. Microfilm of the Moravian Mission archives, the very early archives dating from the 1880s, was obtained. Von Sturmer transferred the mission school papers, including the beautiful paintings of the kids. The Mackenzie's own personal papers and diaries were transferred, along with their photographs, a huge collection of oral histories, and some movie films. There were accompanying records. James Stuckey, a mission worker, put in his papers. Robert Wilson, another worker, put in his as well. Don Seaman, who was working with a radical group around the period 1975 to 77, put in an uncatalogued set of, so far uncatalogued and unaccessible set of papers. There are also contextual archives which National Aboriginal Consultative Council, National Aboriginal Conference, predecessors to AIATSIC, the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. These were public projects, public campaigns. The papers of Fred McCarthy, JPM Long, who was an administrator with the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and Charles Rowley's papers. He was Commissioner for the Aboriginal Land Fund Commission. They had attempted to purchase the Archer River cattle station in '76, and that attempt was foiled by the Queensland Government, but he has detailed papers documenting that. The repatriation attempts. The Dances of Aurukun, our Institute supplied several copies of that film. That was the one made in 1962. Were held on site, but they were held in a tin shed. It was an oven. They were baked. A replacement print was sent in 1982 at Judith McDougall's instigation. It was noted that the community used the film to show visitors, and they would run it at the school. In 1981, 35 boxes of photocopies of the mission archives were sent back. But John Adams, the administrators, wrote back to the Institute saying, "Sad to say that the photocopies sent back here for previous records have no proper home. It's probably not worth doing that again." In the 2003, there was a pilot digitisation project. They filmed the scanned William and Geraldine Mackenzie diaries, but we're not sure whether that was was distributed. I think it's been sat on. But the diaries, or excerpts from the diaries, were published. Well, Geraldine's diaries were published separately. That might have headed it off. As our own attempts have not been successful. We made contact, or tried to contact, the Indigenous Knowledge Centre, but it wasn't staffed this year, not consistently, only for a few weeks. We sent a copy of Take Over the Film to the Business and Development Grants Office at the Aurukun Shire Council, and he said he'd let us know when the Knowledge Centre is operating. And at that point, we'll link and send detailed lists of what we've got and see if there's some kind of package we can make up to supply that organisation. The Aurukun archives have become dormant. We have lost a collaborative relationship with the Aurukun community. The imperative has shifted. Peter Sutton explained that the 1990 version of the Aurukun database, that's the last phase of their projects, the culminative phase, was produced at the request of Wik clan leaders. They wanted support in an application to block Comalco from exploring for oil and gas. That was on the, and they did get it. They did head it off. The support took the form of a report from the digital consolidation of all the site mapping data and other cultural information that had been gathered since the late 1960s. Roger Cribb developed the database under Peter Sutton's direction at the South Australian Museum, supported in part by research grants from the Institute. Their report covers the 2,085 Aboriginal sites along the coast. It's confidential information, not to be copied. It's copyright to traditional owners and the authors. A copy of the report, that is the printout, is lodged with the Aurukun traditional owners in 1990. AIATSIS also holds the copy under restricted access, but as far we don't know where the actual database is. The Aurukun may be South Australian Museum, maybe with Peter Sutton, maybe with Northern Land Council. Aurukun Database Project contributed to the success of the Wik case. David Martin pointed out that the database underlies the Wik native title claim lodged in 1993. It is, he says, the formal compilation of the vast body of anthropological and historical work documenting the complexities and realities of Wik groups' ownership of their traditional lands. The High Court decision on the Wik case in 1998 recognised that pastoral leasehold did not extinguish native title. In 2004, the Federal Court granted Wik landowners claim to lands under 7 pastoral leases and 4 mining titles. The Nungan Kunch Aboriginal Corporation was established to hold further extensive native title interests of the Wik people. Bauxite mining is only now starting on the Aurukun Shire, 60 years after the Comalco Agreement Act of 1957. Rio Tinto is constructing its Amrun mine south of the Wickway land, on Wickway land, south of the Embley River. It's coming down here. The Aurukun bauxite lease, which is still standing from 1975, is this territory. So Rio Tinto is constructing its Amrun mine on Wickway land south of the Embley River. It's due to start production in 2019. The Aurukun bauxite project is likely to begin if Glencore, the current leaseholder, can obtain an Indigenous land use agreement. So we ask, will the mining create circumstances which will revive Wik people's relationship with their archives at AIATSIS? Now Fiona will conclude our talk.
Just to recapitulate, what Aurukun people, no, hang on, let me think. Aurukun people have always said what they wanted. What they have wanted has always been shaped by their circumstances and what they can imagine in these circumstances, but all the way through there has been a clear and strong articulation of community requirements. The AIATSIS Aurukun holdings were based on the active creation of content or records by the Institute in collaboration with and direction from the community. Therefore, that community recorded and mirrored many of the events that were shaping the community. What the research reveals is that we have very deep and broad holdings, and we ourselves didn't actually have a full picture until we began this research to see what we had. We didn't grasp that depth and breadth. The relationship, as Ewan has already said, between AIATSIS and Aurukun went to sleep as the creation of the archive diminished after the success of the Wik case. We asked a number of questions in thinking about what next for administering this archive. We wondered, has it served its purpose in recording activities and functions of a particular period? Is it time to seek out a new round of deposits, both reviving the archive and opening its doors? In opening its doors, how do we restart the collaboration that is such a strong feature of the formation of this archive? Rebuilding the relationship might occur in a number of ways. And all of these are evident as threads in the archive's creation. There's communication from the Aurukun Council in the early stages yet, focuses on reuse in the production of other materials rather than co-management or custody and stewardship. We wondered about a partnership with the Indigenous Knowledge Centre, as Ewan's already alluded to. Will we seed their collection with material repatriated from AIATSIS? To do that, we would need to strengthen our intellectual control over the entire archive so that we can properly offer everything that's available. Will we expand what's available in the archive? What Ewan has described are the products of research and collaboration, but a lot of what he found, a lot of the information is held in our administrative records, and they are just, they're just gold, as you might expect as archivists. And will mining on Wik country restart the relationship? Research for this paper reveals that the archive itself suggests directions for transforming its administration. Maybe there's a pattern and an ebb and flow in the uses and formation and therefore management of an archive. We talk a lot at AIATSIS about how we can maintain relationships, but maybe those relationships are more organic than a constant attention to keeping up the relationship when there's no particular need for it at the time. Over the last couple of days, I've been wondering where the potential for liberation is in this archive. Before the conference, I was thinking that the value of an archive for the subject of records lay in an archive's secondary evidentiary purpose. It's occurred to me during this conference that actually the Aurukun community, through its collaboration with AIATSIS in the formation of the archive, are actually the creators of these holdings as well as the subjects. And therefore the evidentiary use has much greater potential. Being creators as well as subjects may be the key as to why their first thought about how they can reuse this stuff rather than methods of custody and stewardship. Thank you.